أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على رسوله محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Thank you very much for joining us once again for another episode of My Journey Through Islam. Now today's guest is Brother Roderic. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam.
Thank you very much for joining us. Now we've been speaking to many people over this series about their journey through Islam. Now can you tell us where your journey began with regards to religion? Were you from a religious background? What were you doing from a very young age?
Yeah, I was born into a practicing Christian family from the Protestant side of Christianity, and I can remember from my earliest days in primary school attending church with my parents, and it was, that was down in Surrey at the time, and at around the age of 6.5, my father got a job in York, and we moved up north, and I was enrolled into the York Minster Song School, which is attached to the cathedral in York. Eventually, in a year later, when I got to 7, becoming one of the choir boys, singing in the cathedral every day except for Wednesdays. We would attend the cathedral in the mornings for practice, and then there was evensong, as they call it, in the afternoons at around 4 o'clock until about 5. And on Sundays there were three services we had to attend, in the morning and in the afternoon.
So was this at the same time as going to school?
That's right.
So yes. You'd go in the morning before school, then you would go to school, then you'd go afterwards?
That's right, yeah. So in the morning we would go first to the cathedral, practice, and then at around 9:30, I think it was, we would cross over the road to the school, which was just about 100 yards from the entrance to the cathedral. And carry on until the afternoon, and then leave a little bit earlier than those who are not in the choir, and attend again for practice, and followed by the church service.
So you were in the choir
every day. Yes.
You were in the choir of a huge, grand building, the York Minster, which many people know of.
Yeah. It is. It's famous for being not the tallest, but it is the largest Gothic structure in Europe, I understand.
So how long did you do this for, and where did that take you in life from there?
Well, obviously being a choir boy depends on having a good voice, and starting at the age of 7, as anyone will know who's sort of gone beyond the age of 13, but for boys and adolescent young men, their voice breaks at around the age of 13, and all of a sudden you find yourself without a job, if you like. And so they kept us in that school until what is today, I think, year 9, and then I transferred into one of the local grammar schools where I continued my education.
Okay. So did you continue attending the church there, or did you do anything else religiously from that age?
Well, it was a Church of England school, and each morning there was what today's legislation calls an act of collective worship, which was Christian, with singing of a hymn, with prayers, and with one of the teachers perhaps giving some meditation for us to consider. And at the same time, I would also, immediately after I'd left the cathedral, I started going to the local parish church in the village. But then when I got to 15, it must have been, I decided to go with a friend of mine from the school to a different church inside York, which is just next to York Minster, which is a Church of England sort of evangelical sort of church. And the reason why I enjoyed that was because there were other people of my age who attended, which wasn't perhaps the case so much in the village church, who loved reading about God in the Bible and being together and talking about religious subjects, about issues of faith. Whereas I found, even at this Church of England school, that there were some people who had been with me in the choir who seemed to have changed and started talking about, thinking it was more clever to adopt a sort of maybe a Dawkins-style Darwin approach, a Dawkins-type interpretation of Darwin's sort of research and theories. And here, I could be with other people for whom talking about God was not seen as something embarrassing or idiotic.
I think it's good. It's good that you mentioned that, because even for the viewers, for those who are maybe already Muslim, who are at that age of maybe 13, 14, 15, 16, who sometimes when you think of being religious at that age, it can be seen as a taboo, or it can be seen as something negative. But being around people, and it seems like you're already attending halaqat and study circles at that age. I think it's quite good to hear that you can kind of attend these circles. And where did that take you from that age, from 15 onwards? What happened?
Well, I carried on going there, and there was the regular service that I would attend at that church was on a Sunday evening, and that was followed by a youth group meeting in a hall not far from the church, where either the vicar or somebody else, one of the elders of the church, would give a talk about an aspect of say Christianity, which was useful for young people. Followed by sort of tea and coffee, again sort of informal halaqah. And on Friday evenings we would go to the house of one of the priests from the church and study the Bible.
Okay.
So that was a weekly thing that we would do. Occasionally, if I stayed with one of my close friends who would go with me to that church, although he'd been brought up as a Roman Catholic, I would attend with him in the morning, on a Sunday morning, at the Roman Catholic church. I had a feeling that it was a Christian, rather than sometimes one hears division. But for me, one of the important aspects of faith is to try and find unity and find common ground with other people, rather than to be divided from others.
So looking at your life from a young age, you were very active in terms of you were always around people who were talking about God and were reading the Bible, and who were trying to connect with their Creator, with their Maker. At this age, did you have ambitions or goals in life to either become a priest or to work in the church, or did you have other goals and ambitions alongside your religious practices?
Well, it's difficult at the age of 13. I can remember we were asked as I moved to the other school, what career we thought we might like, and I had read a number of sort of inspiring books of that nature, and it seemed to me that medical missionary might be rather interesting. But I didn't actually go further than what was then, the GCSE equivalents then, down the science route. But the religious side of things I carried on with, and I can remember at around the age of 16, 17, I used to discuss with one of my close friends. We'd always be talking, maybe arguing, you might say, as teenagers, about different topics from politics to religion and so on. And thinking things through, I came to this feeling that the doctrine that Jesus, peace be on him, is the Son of God, in any literal sense, just seemed illogical.
And how old were you at this age when you started to question this?
between 16 and 17,
Okay.
as I recall. But I continued going to church because, for me, God was an important part of my life. And that was the place in York at that time. Now there's much more ethnically mixed society in York. But at that time, I'm not even sure there was a mosque in York. Perhaps there was in sort of 76, 77. But I continued going, and I believe, I must have made my feelings felt, because whereas my peers were being asked one week to perhaps lead the next Bible study or to say prayers on behalf of the group at the end of each session, I was never asked. And I've subsequently thought that maybe they twigged that I was perhaps not entirely orthodox from their point of view.
So at that time in your life, you had a question, and maybe people felt that you were questioning something. They might not have taken it in the most positive way. I'm going to have to stop you there just to go on a short break, but we'll come back inshallah, and we hope you can join us for part 2 of this episode with Brother Roderic, and please do join us after the break. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and thank you for joining us for part 2 of today's episode of My Journey Through Islam with Brother Roderic. So, in your journey to Islam, through Islam, to the heart of Islam, you've reached a point in your life when you're 16, 17 years old, and you have started to question, in a way, the doctrine of Jesus being the Son of God. And what implications did this have on your life, maybe with your relationship with your friends or with family?
Oh, there was no particular problem at that time. I was, to all intents and purposes, a Christian. I was going to church on a very regular basis and interacting with other people. And as a Christian, as good a Christian as I thought I could be. And when I got to my A-levels, we were asked to about what we wished to study, and at that time my favourite subject was Latin, but I had a problem with literature and appreciating literature, and I thought what I would really like to do, having studied Greek as a child in the cathedral, to read the New Testament in the original language, that what I'd like to do is to study actually Sanskrit. Because it was related to Greek and Latin, and I hoped secretly that if I could study that language, there would be enough time taken up looking at the grammar and learning the language itself before we started getting on too much detail of the literature, that I would have got enough marks to sort of squeeze through without showing that I really didn't understand or appreciate literature in any way.
So that was your thinking at that point?
Yeah. But unfortunately, my A-level results weren't good enough, and I ended up having to wait in the clearing system and got in. Instead of going to Edinburgh University then, I ended up going to Manchester on the clearing system on some combined studies course. And there the combination wasn't particularly attractive, but then, I hadn't got excellent results. But I was able to change the combination before it started to include Persian language, along with comparative religion and archaeology. And as I completed the first year, what I really wanted to do was to change onto what was called Oriental Studies. And the language I finally settled on was Arabic. And I continued with that for the remainder of the 4 years of the course. In my final year, we had a special subject we had to choose, and I chose to do the editing and translation of a short excerpt from a manuscript in Farsi. And we settled on with my tutor, settled on a Mughal text relating to music. But going through the catalogues, I found that there were manuscripts of translations of Hindu scriptures and Buddhist texts into Farsi during the Mughal period. And I thought to myself, well, this would be really interesting to bring together what I had wanted to study, which was the Sanskrit side, and with what I had in fact studied because my A-level results hadn't been good enough. And I sort of earmarked that, if you like, for the possible research after my first degree was over.
So your first degree was in?
Persian with Arabic.
So you learned the Persian language and the Arabic language?
And the Arabic.
Is that all based in Manchester, or were you travelling around to
unfortunately, I wasn't able to go overseas then because I started my degree in September of 78, and then shortly after that the revolution occurred in Iran. And although by the time I was supposed to travel, the Iranian consulate was issuing visas for foreign students to attend universities, to do Islamic studies courses, the local education authority, which in those days funded undergraduate study, was a little bit afraid about sending its student.
Yeah, understandable.
So I never went, and I never went to Iran at that time.
But you learned the language.
But I learned the language.
So you still speak a bit of Farsi, a bit of Persian now?
Yes, I still do. Yeah.
And you learned Arabic then. And where did your journey take you from there? So you've got your first degree, implying that there are more degrees to come.
Yeah.
And what did you do next?
Well, I wanted to take some time out. Obviously, studying Arabic in university at that time, although we had 1 hour a week that was supposed to be conversation, it was really like studying Latin. It was more of a dead language where it was you read texts, translate them into English, but the actual speaking of it was not there. And I wanted to go and live in the Middle East and to perfect my language. Now, at that time, I really wanted to go to Iran, but then they'd stopped issuing visas to foreigners. And so I ended up going to Egypt and teaching English to earn a living, whilst at the same time sort of learning to speak Arabic. We talk about the University of Life in Egypt. We talk about Madrasat al-Haya, the school of life. And that's where I sort of became sort of immersed in an Arabic and Islamic and Christian culture, which is what Egypt is.
So at that time you were already, so you were Christian at that time,
yes.
And you travelled there. And were you already interacting with Muslims at that point here in the UK? Or?
Well, obviously there were people in the department, and I also had friends, Iranian friends. So my Farsi was very good at that time, but they were from what were called the Tudeh party. So there was more of a dialectical materialist, a little bit more Marxist sort of side. But we enjoyed speaking together in Farsi, and they were happy to talk with that. But in Egypt, I found that I had to relearn Arabic pretty much, but it was an enjoyable experience. And I found that just like in this country, there are good people, there are bad people. That Islam, as a religion, isn't. It's not a magical thing that makes people good. It depends on the individual what effort they want to put into it. I can remember the first time I fasted during Ramadan. I was not a Muslim, but in Cairo in the middle of summer. So it was included the longest day, which is considerably shorter than the days here, and it was a lot harder than the following year. I finished 1 year in Cairo and then started studying for a PhD in Edinburgh University.
So you stayed in Egypt for
a year.
1 year. You perfected in a way. You practiced your Arabic language. You earned a living for a while, but you were not studying as such.
I wasn't studying. I was teaching to earn a living and just wandering around, meeting people, and learning the language.
And then you came back to continue studies here in the UK, in Edinburgh University. And what did you study then?
Well, I studied, as I mentioned, I'd found these manuscripts of translations of Hindu scriptures, and I could remember, as an undergraduate, thinking, well, there must be better ways of teaching about Islam. And even in those days, in the early 80s, there were negative portrayals of Islam. I part of being at school in the early 70s. I can remember drawing pictures of sort of crusaders and Saracens, Muslim soldiers, and these sort of crusades was a thing. But there were things that we were taught which were interesting, but not really central to Islam. I mean, one of the things that we studied as an undergraduate in Islamic history, for example, was about the satanic verses, which is something that you find in sources like Tabari, in Bayhaqi and elsewhere, references to it, but it is not a core teaching.
Yeah. So you were introduced to...
So I was thinking, well, here was a way of joining together what I'd wanted to study when I was at school, what I had studied as an undergraduate, and also taking a topic which would help to portray Islam in a more positive sense. And I wasn't a Muslim when I started, and certainly when I chose the subject. But the subject was Indo-Persian interpretations of the Bhagavad Gita. So the teachings of Krishna by Sufis, Muslims, not in order to convert Hindus necessarily, although the Sufis were the main force, if you like, in the conversion of Hindus to Islam within the subcontinent.
Yeah, so at this point you were already not helping Islam as such, but you were trying to portray Islam in a positive way for the sake of humanity, I guess, as a whole.
Not just for human relations,
So you already had this sort of connection, I guess, to Islam in a way. What I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to stop you there. There's so much to cover and there's so much that we could talk about, but inshallah we'll continue to talk about this in the next episode, and we hope that you can join us, and we hope that you can join us for another episode of My Journey Through Islam with Brother Roderic, and inshallah we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us the ability to be here once again to benefit from each other's journeys through Islam. Thank you very much for listening. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.